Hey gang, Kiki here. I wanted to put together kind of a presentation, if you will, and to teach you some of the background information that deals with To Kill a Mockingbird. Before we left, we were going to have the opportunity to spend about 2 weeks doing research on the historical and cultural background when looking at the writing of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. So, what I wanted to do is really quickly go through a presentation with you that I would have given in a classroom and give you some of that background information as we approach the court case of Tom Robinson, because it's very important understanding some of the historical context of it. We also have an activity, or I have an activity for you to do as well. It's a web quest, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So here's our targets for the lesson. It says you are going to identify the historical, cultural, social, and geographical context of the setting, writing, and the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, the second bullet we're not going to pay attention to because we're not going to do the first part of this presentation because we're not in class. At the end, I want you to be able to say that you can comprehend how the historical, cultural, social, and geographical, meaning the location of the South compared to up here in the Northwest, geographical context of the setting influenced Harper Lee's apostrophe S. See if I can these tools. Harper Lee's. That's pretty good. I know. Maybe I should make it more. Yeah. So anyway, Harper Lee's writing of the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. So let's go ahead and start off with traveling back in time to the end of the Civil War in 1865. And we're going to look at what is known to be called the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, some of you, I'm sure you know these amendments as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But let's talk about each one and how they work. So the 13th Amendment, which established at the end of 1865, was designed to abolish slavery, period. Okay? And what is known as involuntary servitude, which you'll see more today around the world, where they're, a lot of times dealing with women and children, where they're kidnapping them and holding them captive to do as they will around the world. So that's involuntary servitude. Except, it says, except as punishment for a crime, because a lot of people will say, well, Ms. Kiki, what about the fact that going to jail? I mean, that's against my will, but you have committed a crime and you're welcome. You're going to jail. So that is the 13th Amendment, and President Lincoln was the one pressed this one through. And if you did some research on the Civil War, you might find that the war actually went longer than it should have because Abraham Lincoln wanted to guarantee the passing of the 13th Amendment, because without the war, you didn't have that looming over everybody's heads a little bit. And it was so important that we got that passed. Now, the 14th Amendment, it talks about how all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of this here United States of America and the state in which they reside. So if I was born in Spokane, Washington, well, I'm a resident of Washington State. If I became naturalized in the state of Washington, then I would become a resident of Washington State. And so at the end of the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery within the 13th Amendment, if you were an African American and you were in the state of Alabama at the time and you were freed, abolished from slavery, you became naturalized and a resident of the state of Alabama. So that's how it works. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities, I even have my glasses on, of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of, and you've heard this one, life, liberty, property, without due process of the law. So that is the 14th Amendment. Again, that every person born in the United States is an American citizen.
or if you become naturalized in the state. The 15th Amendment prohibits the denial of right to vote based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were the foundations of the Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction meaning the country coming back together after war. So we're going to keep coming back to these as we go. But I want to talk about some more of the historical elements behind these three amendments and how they affected the rest of the country. So here's some of the responses to the 15th Amendment. For example, in Mississippi, they came up with a thing called the Mississippi Plan in 1890, which they did a clever job of creating a way of disenfranchising Black voters in the state. And so here is the four-step process they used within that state, because every state has the right to run itself and govern itself. And you're seeing that right now with all these different governors in the United States right now, trying to figure out what they're going to do with this COVID situation. Some are wanting to open up, like I think today Idaho is opening up. Washington, I heard the senator governor talk today, and Inslee is like, there's nothing in sight really, but he wants to try to get people back fishing. Anywho, that's besides the point. Here's the four components of this Mississippi Plan. Number one, residence requirement of 2 years in that state. So you have to live in that state for 2 years before you can qualify. And step number one is right to vote. Number two, you must have good behavior requirements, which oftentimes you would see would disenfranchise anyone who was an ex-convict. So if you were probably in the South, Black man, and you were trumped up on a charge made up, if you will, and you got arrested, well, you don't have good behavior. Number three, a tax requirement. A poll tax was put out there for individuals. And for example, as it says here, $2 was a poll tax, which would equate in about 2013, I had here, about $14. So if you were somebody who was just recently freed as a slave and now as a free man, you have to find a job, you have kids to feed, you have a wife, a place to stay, you have all these things, and to have some extra money to go pay a poll tax for at some degree or level, just so you can vote, was not very likely. And then finally, number four, a literacy requirement. In the activity I have at the end, I want you to take the time and go through, and there's an example of a literary test that you have to take to be able to have the right to vote in certain states. It is difficult. I've had some kids do really well. Most kids really struggle at it. So it's pretty cool to see that historical context there as well. So again, you must be there for 2 years. You have good behavior. You have to pay a poll tax, and you have to pass literary requirements. You have to know things about the Constitution. The problem here is if you were a Black man, you did not get an education, so it's very unlikely that you knew how to read or write, and thus the information you may not have had opportunity to expose yourself to that as well. So again, tricky, very creative Mississippi, 1890, to find a way to disenfranchise voters. Now, here's an example of, in Louisiana, for example, this is a poll tax that you would have to pay. And this one is for public schools. So this would be one of those examples. The response still, the 15th Amendment, Louisiana created and developed, and you've probably heard of this term, it's a grandfather clause, like I've been grandfathered in so I can do something or not do something. Oftentimes I talk about those individuals who hunt. There was a date in which if you hunted prior to this date, you did not have to take a hunter safety course. But if you'd never hunted prior to that case, you would have to take it. So if I had hunted and had a hunting license prior to a certain date, I would say I'm grandfathered in and I don't have to go take the hunter safety course. So that's kind of how a grandfather clause works. Well, in 1898, Louisiana came up with this idea that if
your grandfather or your father voted before January 1st, 1867, if one of those two voted prior to that date, you automatically were grandfathered in and had the right to vote. The only problem here, if you were a black man, is your father nor your grandfather voted, so it excluded black voters, where white voters, if your father or grandfather, which probably did, you had the right to vote. So that happened and started in 1867. By 1910, we have numerous other states, as you can see here, that also adopted the grandfather clause process. The Mississippi Plan and the grandfather clause, both, I mean, tell you, remarkable at disenfranchising black voters in the South. I have some, let me go back here. I have some data here at the bottom you can see. We have this one here and this one here. And here you can see how there were 130,000 black voters in 1896, but there was only 5,320 voters in Louisiana in 1900. So you can see how the numbers changed. So we keep going here, grandfather clause. This is the case of all cases when it looked at changes that lasted roughly, well, yeah, almost 100 years. A guy by the name of Homer Plessy, he was all accounts, he was a white man, but he was considered 7/8 white. And his grandmother, his great grandmother, excuse me, she was from Africa, so he was only an eighth black. But at this time, during the era of the Jim Crow laws or segregation, post Civil War, even before, there was this thing called the one drop rule. And if you had, they would say, even one drop of African American blood within you, you were a black man or a black woman, and thus you were to be separated. Okay, so he gets on the train, plus he does in 1896, and he decides to test the system. There was a policy already established within the train cars, which they had separated blacks and whites in the train cars. Well, he's in the train car, he buys a ticket, and he's a white man. He stands up and he basically says, I'm a black man and I'm riding on a white car. And everybody's like, just be quiet, sit down. No, you're not. Stop your nonsense. And he kept pushing it and pushing it. Finally, they pushed it and pushing it, tested, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I'm definitely shrinking up this whole story for you to get through it, and I recommend you going through and reading more about Homer Plessy. What a man in trying to test the system right there. What happened at the end of the whole Supreme Court case is they came up with what is known as the separate but equal, which evolved in, as you can see circled here, into what is known as the Jim Crow laws. Okay, so we go all the way back to the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case. So don't forget that one and Homer Plessy. So let's keep going here. The effects of these said separate but equal or Jim Crow laws is that it started to create a sense of segregation. Now, you may have seen movies where if during the time period of the Jim Crow laws, that restaurants, blacks had to eat in the back and enter in the rear of the restaurant. Whites would eat up front. Movie theaters, whites would be down below, blacks up top, and they'd have to enter in the back of the theater. And oftentimes they had their own theaters that were said to be equal to those of the white community's theaters. Drinking fountains, bathrooms. I mean, the world was separated by this one Supreme Court case that created the separate but equal or the Jim Crow laws. Marriage was segregated. In fact, I was born in 1969, and I always look at this just like, this is crazy. In 1967, there were still 16 states in the South that still had legal laws of separation of marriage based on race. Okay?
And finally, the Supreme Court ruled this was not to take place anymore. So all the way up to 1967, you still had these cases. Excuse me. There were at least 4,742 known lynchings. Now, lynchings were done on both black, white, Mexican, uh, Chinese. You saw those across the board, but predominantly lynchings were done by whites on blacks within, primarily in the South. Again, the activity I have you do at the very end is, again, the activity, there's an interactive map where you can click on individual states and you can see the data pop up between whites and blacks and who were lynched. You can see the geographical differences of lynching. So again, lynching often meant death, mind you, but not always meant death. Severe beatings. Oftentimes in the South, there was hangings that were involved, and we'll talk about that as well. There were at least 4,742 known lynchings in the United States between 1882 and 1968. 85% of the 4,742 victims were African Americans, though, as I said, whites, Asians, Latinos were also lynched as well. 87% of this number took place in the New South. There were 188 lynchings a year. That was a year between 1890 and 99, and 93 lynchings there. So you can see kind of a breakdown of it. Spectacle lynchings were public events attended by entire communities, white communities, known as like the Jesse Washington was lynched in Waco, Texas, in front of 15,000 people, cheering crowds. And after a court case, residents took the punishment into their own hands, and people just filled the street and hung this man. So people in the Old South even made postcards, and you can find those, the historical elements. And one of the things you'll see, as I've said before, I taught history for about 15 years, and oftentimes you would see in textbooks, these pictures of a black man hanging from a tree, one or two, and you have all these just local community folk, white folk, standing around, and you could just see their cheers and on their faces. And I always just emotionally just gets me that you see just children sometimes in these pictures, and the women in their dresses and their hats, just the evil in their faces. And so, within these public lynchings, you would also see, people sending postcards around the South or even to their friends up north and this time period. So now, all of this changed. Now, in 1964, there was the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, there was the Voting Rights Act. And I remember learning these in college, and I remember teaching these in history class, U.S. history. And it wasn't really, I'll be honest with you, until I spent time really looking at Harper Lee's novel and doing my research and some of the data that I've provided for you here, doing graduate work out at Eastern with some of the professors out there. Li Ping Zhu is one of them. And that I understood why we had to have the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Over 100 years from the time the Civil War ended. And the Civil Rights Act got rid of the Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal. That's why it existed. The Civil Rights Act, that's right. In 1965, it got rid of the grandfather clause, the Mississippi Plan, all those things that disenfranchised black voters in the South. At this time, you got to remember back in 1920, women got the right to vote. This year is 2020. This is the 100-year anniversary of women's right to vote. So in 65, now everyone has the right to vote. Man, woman, it doesn't matter the color of skin. You can't disenfranchise. So Lyndon B. Johnson was the president. Kennedy, in a sense, was starting this process. Actually, it started all the way back in Eisenhower And finally, Lyndon B. Johnson just said, this is a time, man, long time coming. It's time now that we will get this done in 64 and 65. I have a video that I want to share with you, and hoping it works here. You can see it as you look at the screen, and the audio works as we go. It's about 4 minutes. It's a little bit about the Jim Crow laws and what is Jim Crow? Who is Jim Crow? Is he actually a guy? So let's check it out here.
Listen, all you gals and boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river.
In 1836, Jim Crow is born. He begins his strange career as a malicious minstrel caricature of a black man, created by a white man to amuse white audiences. Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in little over a decade, that promise was gone, replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
But I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
My dad said, as long as you're living in this South, you're going to have to go to the back door in this town. And you just settle for that. He said, but one thing I want you to swear and promise to me, that you will never get used to it.
I'm not ashamed of the segregated and Jim Crow experience, all because we were able to devise techniques for survival that permitted us to abide our time and to wait until our change come.
As most blacks were willing to bide their time, some began to fight back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they embarked on an uncertain campaign to secure voting rights, build their own communities, schools, businesses, and churches, and to demand redress against mob violence and lynching. The white supremacists fought back. By 1919, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been a Southern idiosyncrasy, became a national ideology. White supremacy, the power behind Jim Crow, appeared invincible. And over the next decade, the violence against blacks would grow even more horrific. But black Americans continued to battle, using the power of the press and ultimately the power of the courts to pursue their quest for freedom and equality against racism. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is their story, the story of strong men and women who would never accept the demeaning, threatening, and perilous world of Jim Crow. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of those who, in the face of unending terror, achieved triumphs. Triumphs that would in time make America a better place, not just for themselves, but for all of us.
As the video said, a lot of good men and women who fought for these rights. And the activity that I'm going to have you do for the rest of the week here is involving some of these good people, learning about who they are and what they did. So I'm going to jump out of this here. So here's an activity that I'm going to upload into to Edmodo. It's called the Jim Crow and Segregation. It's an web quest, an interactive activity for you. So all you'll have to do is either copy and paste this link or just click it in Edmodo and open it up. And you can hit Control, as it says, Control, and click. Now you can type your answers. You can download this into a Word document, and you can answer all the questions within that process. Type it all in there, and then save it, and then you can email it back to me for a grade. If you want to print it off and handwrite it all, and then take a picture of the front and back, and then send it to me, it's up to you. You know, the most important thing for me right now is you to get through this information, have some contextual background when it looks at the case dealing with Tom Robinson and Atticus and the kids in this novel. So here, I'm going to go through the questions real fast. I'm going to hit the website. So there's different parts. Part one, I want you to go in and learn a little bit about the voting expectations. What was the voting experience like for African Americans during the Jim Crow era? You have some background from my lecture, and you're going to learn some more from this website. So just answer that within your own words. Is voting valued today as it once was? Explain what you know about voting today compared to the time that you're learning. Click here. It says click Try to Vote within the website, and go through the quiz to see if you can get the right to vote. That's the one I talked about with the literacy test. Once you're complete with that test, or how far you want to go into it, take a few sentences, talk about what that was like for you to try to pass that test. Jim Crow stories, again, you'll just go on the website, it says Jim Crow stories, and then find these three individuals, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, and W.E.B. Du Bois. Their pictures were in the movie as well when they were showing the individuals. So I want you to learn a little bit more about them and what they did for Black rights, civil rights, and American history. I want you to continue and learn here under Jim Crow stories about the Atlanta Compromise and the Niagara Movement. Both of those use some information, evidence from the websites, the answer to these, Plessy versus Ferguson. You can learn it from that site as well, and from my lecture. Well, and Great Migration, there's a term there under this section, and the NAACP, which again still exists today, and they have a chapter right here in Spokane. I met the president, had an opportunity to speak with him on a panel. Great man. So then you have the interactive maps, what I talked about, where you click on the individual states, and make sure you answer all parts of these questions as well. So it's a 2-page dealing with different questions. So let's go and check out this website, and then I'm going to finish it up so you guys can get to what you need to do. Excuse me. So here's the website. It's called The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow. Great website put together by PBS. That's right. PBS is one of the big supporters in this website. So on the right, you have a century of segregation. Here's the Jim Crow stories that I talked about, a national story, the interactive maps, tools, and activities. So let's go and let's check out the Jim Crow stories. So under Jim Crow stories, you have people. You have some personal narratives. You can go through as much in all of this as you want to. Great information, great for next year when you may be within your world history, or even better, your junior year when it gets to one of your American history classes. You get a step up on the process. So let's click on people. Keep scratching. I haven't shaved for a month. I'm trying to figure out how long I want to go in my old man gray hair. So you scroll down here, you have pictures, you got maybe some of the videos of their work. You have Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells, so W.E.B. over here, and you can keep going to whoever you want. Those are just three very popular, well-known ones. You have some video and audio here that you can go to. Events, let's see what they have under events. You have the Great Depression, which we're being compared to now. Scottsboro Boy case. We're going to look at that one as an activity, possibly, before we go. Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember that question there, so you can find that and more information on that one. Here's the Niagara movement down here. So some of those questions, the Great Migration. So again, under here you have people and you have events that you can get to some of these questions here. Let's go back here. Let's click the very first one. You can see a timeline. So national struggle. And we can learn about President Abraham Lincoln, Congress during the Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, Supreme Court cases that we looked at as well. Okay. This is a rich site to go through. Let's go to interactive maps. Let's check that out. Interactive maps. Go to maps. Yes, please. Map. What? Click enable. Darn it. All right. So, Jim Crow laws, population migration, lynchings, and riots. Let me see here. Jim Crow laws. You learn about education, hospitals and prisons, what they were like during this, public transportation, and if you click on one state, it's going to give you information about railroads and how they worked in those states. Back to map. So that would be under Jim Crow laws, college, university, population migration, which was one of the questions here. So this is really fascinating for me. So you have 1870. You hold this over any state, you can see the population of blacks versus white in that state. And then you can also see by clicking on the different years, you can see the migration patterns and how many people left that state. Let's go over here to one of the deep South states here. And you can see we have almost 500,000, almost equal, just a few more whites and blacks in 1870. Okay. Now let's go to 1930s. Now you can definitely see the jump within whites. 1960s. The black population does not grow like it does. But one thing you can notice here is see right over here where it says minus 191,000. That means during that time period, that decade, that's how many black Americans left that state and probably headed north, because the migration traditionally from the South went north. And if you went north, you can see the growth in those states during those years. It's pretty cool. Washington, we even had growth as well. 1870, Washington, you can see we had less than 500 blacks in Washington state in 1870. Oregon. So, I mean, you could just spend quite a bit of time in here messing around with this here. Okay, so let's go back to lynching and riots. I don't want to show you too much because I want you to go through this and learn yourself. So I'll just take Texas. This is how many lynchings were in Texas. Blacks, 352, and 141 whites. As I said, whites were also lynched as well. Shoot up to Washington State, 1 black, 25 whites were lynched in Washington State. So these states don't have any data on them other than just 1 white, no blacks within this realm up in the north. So have some fun, go through this interactive maps and check it out. And so that's really it for the week. I kind of want you, if you got to chapter 12, like you're supposed to have done, that was our plan, right? During our 5 weeks off, that I want you to take a week off and step back from the novel if you'd like, and finish this, go through this lesson, and then begin the Jim Crow activity where you're answering the questions. And I'd like to have you by next Wednesday, we're going to start a different one. Okay. All right, guys. Really miss you guys, and I'll talk about this obviously on Wednesday because I'm making this here on Monday for you guys, and I will put on Edmodo on Wednesday. So you guys rule. Miss your faces. Take care of yourselves.